The defence of self-defence or prevention of crime is made up of two parts or two elements. And a person attempting to use the defence has to convince the jury of two things. The first of these is that the force they used was necessary in the circumstances as they believe them to be. So the jury is faced with this question: did the defendant, who's being charged with causing perhaps serious injury to somebody, need to use force at that point? And then the second requirement, we look at the amount of force used, and the jury's asked to consider if it was reasonable in the circumstances that this lady hit the guy 3 or 4 times with a rolling pin, that somebody shot somebody in the back. Was it reasonable to use force in those circumstances? If they can convince the jury of these two things, then potentially they have a defence of self-defence, and it's a full defence to nearly every crime, including murder. So let's look at this first question. Was it necessary for the defendant to use force? Now, of course, the jury will look at the circumstances and have the facts as the defendant believed them to be. And potentially, if the attacker or the burglar is running away, or perhaps is on the floor already because you've dealt him a blow to the head and he's fallen over, then potentially if you attack at this point, the jury may well believe that it wasn't necessary, but it will of course depend on the circumstances. Let's say you had an intruder in your house and you hit him once on the head and he fell on the floor, and your children are upstairs and he starts to move. You may well think that it's necessary at that point to hit him again. And if you can convince the jury that you did that because you were fearful that he might get up and use violence against you, or violence against the other people in the house, then it would still be thought to be necessary at that point. So it very much depends on the circumstances as the defendant believed them to be. But if the burglar or the attacker is running away and there is no real threat or danger at that point, and you use force there, that force feels more like revenge rather than a necessity to use force to defend yourself or to prevent a crime. I've already said a couple of times that when it comes to necessity and the need to use force, the jury need to take the facts as the defendant believed them to be. So I often get asked the question, what if the defendant makes a mistake and thinks they need to use force? They think they're being attacked by someone, or they're potentially going to be attacked by someone, and they lash out first. Take this young lady here who's walking home after a night out and thinks she's being followed. If she attacked that person, used force to defend herself, she could still claim it was necessary, even if it turned out that the person who was following her had no intention whatsoever to attack her. So if we have a mistaken belief that we need to use force, the jury must take the facts as we believe them to be, unless that mistaken belief was caused by voluntary intoxication. So if the defendant is high on drugs or alcohol and mistakenly believes that someone's going to attack them, and so they attack first in order to defend themselves, then the jury would believe in that situation, or would be told that voluntary intoxication, because they're voluntarily intoxicated, they cannot use the defense of self-defense, because you can't have a mistaken belief that's been caused by drugs or alcohol. When deciding whether it was necessary for the defendant or not to use force, the jury will also be told that defendants can make what's called a preemptive strike. They can strike first if they have the belief that the person they are striking against was about to commit a crime, was about to attack them. And in the case of, say, police officers obviously can make preemptive strikes in order to prevent a crime. That could be a terrorist attack, or someone who's holding somebody hostage. In these types of situations, it doesn't mean that the force wasn't necessary just because you have struck first. You can make a preemptive strike. There is also no duty to retreat or any obligation, in other words, on the defendant to run away if they can. But juries will be told to take into consideration the fact that, perhaps the defendant could have retreated, could have got away, didn't have to use force, it wasn't necessary. So it can be taken into consideration by the jury. Even though there's no duty, they will think about it and think, well, perhaps in this situation, this person did have another option. You can, of course, prepare to defend yourself. If you hear that a burglar's breaking in downstairs and you rush to your daughter's room to get a cricket bat and downstairs to the kitchen to get a knife, those preparations are allowed because the threat that you are defending yourself from is imminent. Taking a knife into town, however, is not a preparation that the courts recognise. And neither are booby traps, booby trapping your house. Some people get a little bit upset about that. You cannot create a booby trap as a preparation to defend yourself. Interestingly, there was a well-known case involving a shopkeeper who prepared to defend himself by making Molotov cocktails or petrol bombs. And the court decided that this preparation to defend himself was allowed because the threat from those who were rioting and potentially attacking his shop was sufficiently imminent. So let's have a quick recap of this first question in the defense of self-defense. Was it necessary for the defendant to use force? As we said, the jury must take the facts as the defendant believed them to be. You can have a mistaken belief in the need to use force, but it mustn't be an intoxicated belief. You can make a preemptive strike as long as you think the other person is going to attack first or commit a crime. You can prepare to defend yourself, but only if the threat is imminent. And you don't have to retreat, but if you don't, when you could have, then the jury can take this into consideration when considering whether it was necessary for the defendant to use force or not.